So in 1.3, talking about expenses and revenue, specifically talking about how the cost of an item is going to affect its price. Right, starting to tackle this question of how businesses make the decisions they do, and that includes how businesses make the pricing decisions that they do. So just some types of expenses first. Expenses are just anything that's going to cost the business money. So sometimes you'll see the word cost instead of expense, but it all means the same thing. So we have variable expenses. Pick a different color here. And variable expenses are expenses that depend on the quantity of items being produced. This is going to be the key word here, key phrase here. It all comes down to the quantity of items being produced. So these would be things like the cost of materials. If you're an online business, maybe this includes the cost of shipping, right? The more I produce, the more it's going to cost me to ship. Um, Potentially labor, right? The more items I need to produce, the more people I need to have on hand to help me produce them sometimes. Those are just some examples. Well, on the other side of this, we have fixed expenses, and fixed expenses do not depend on the quantity produced. They may still vary based on other factors, but our key here, our metric here is quantity produced, and fixed expenses do not change based on the quantity, right? So these would be things like rent of office space. These might be things like insurance or licensing. There are other examples too. I'm actually going to have you guys come up with some on your own in class. They may still vary, right? Rent is going to vary based on the size of your size of your space, but they don't vary based on the quantity produced, right? I can't say that the more I produce, the more rent I have directly. That's not really how that's going to work. So total expenses, we kind of want to put this all together, can be represented mathematically as the sum of fixed and variable expenses. So we're going to say my total expenses, and we're going to call it E for expense, can be written as the sum of my fixed expenses plus my variable expenses. And that's kind of it. And this is going to usually allow us to come up with some sort of linear function of quantity, of Q. We're going to talk about what this means in a minute. We're going to come back to this equation in a second. But for now, let's talk about moving from the cost of a business making an item to the cost of you purchasing the item, and that's with something called revenue. And revenue is simply the income a business receives from selling a product. It's represented as price times quantity, as you can see here. So I've got this handy little formula, P times Q. This is actually a very intuitive concept, and it's hiding behind some larger words. So let's just say, for example, I'm selling tickets to Prout's Fall Show, and I say that it's $15 a ticket, no matter where I sit. Right? If I have a family come up and they're going to buy 5 tickets, well, then I just made $15 a ticket for 5 tickets, and that's going to be $75. That is my revenue. That's all it is. It's the price of the ticket times the quantity that was purchased. So it's not a complicated topic. It's not a complicated concept. It's just hiding behind and being complicated by the wording of the definition. So revenue, price times quantity. It's how much I sell times how many I sell. How much I sell it for times how many I sell. Well, when we're looking at a business model, obviously we want to come out making more than it's going to cost us to produce. Right? I always want to make sure I come out with what we would call a profit. This is something that maybe I'm going to use a different color so it stands out a little bit better. I'm going to call this a profit. We're always going to call it a profit. This is a word that we use normally, right? So if revenue is greater than expense, this is a profit. It also means that the difference between my revenue and my expense is positive. I come out with more money than it cost me to produce whatever it is I'm selling. If the difference is negative, we're going to call it a loss, right? I don't want to lose money, but if it costs me more to produce something than I'm making, then I'm losing money. It means that the difference between my revenue and my expense is negative. If I zero out, if I try to find some kind of a neutral color here, if I zero out, my difference in my my revenue minus my expense is exactly zero. We call this the break-even point. Right? So revenue is equal to expense, and we would say that revenue minus expense is equal to zero. We don't necessarily want to break even, right? We're a business, we want to make money. But we tend to look at breaking even as kind of our benchmark. If I know that this is how much it's going to cost me to break even, I know to charge more than that so I make a profit. But just as a heads up, we're generally going to use P in general to denote profit, no matter if it's actually profit or loss. We're just going to always use P to represent profit and to represent this difference between revenue and expense. We're going to discuss this in a lot more detail in the next section. But for now, that's kind of handy just to keep on hand is that formula right there. So let's just look at one example to start. Maybe I'm working for OtterBox and I'm producing phone cases. So the total of my fixed expenses is $17,600. And one thing I'll always say is with a word problem, it's really important to mark up your information as you come across important information. We also know that the materials cost of producing each case is $7.53. The operative word in that is each case. So I want to represent the total expenses as a function of quantity, and then I'll work with it. So, well, I know if I'm working with total expenses, that's going to be the sum of my fixed expenses and my variable expenses. All right, well, this is pretty straightforward. I'm writing a function in terms of quantity, so I have my function notation to remind me that I have an expense function in terms of quantity. And my fixed expenses are $17,600. And my variable expenses, well, my variable expenses depend on the quantity I produce. And kind of the key word, the trigger word for that, is that each case bit. This tells you that what I'm dealing with here is my variable expense. So my variable expense is $753 per item times as many cases as I produce. This is now the function that I'm going to deal with. Well, if I want to produce 500 cases, at what price do I need to sell them in order to break even? There are two steps going on here, right? Well, if I want to break even, then my revenue and expense need to be equal. So let's find my expense when I produce 500 cases. So I'm just going to substitute in 500. And fortunately, I've done this out ahead of time, and I know that it's going to cost me $21,365 to produce 500 cases. Well, in order to break even, I need to make that much as well, right? So revenue, which is price times quantity, needs to be equal to 21,365. And my question is, at what price do I need to sell these items? At what price? I should have highlighted price in order to break even. So I'm solving for price, and I know my quantity is 500 because I'm trying to break even on 500 cases. So I'm going to divide. Again, fortunately, I did this ahead of time, so just to save some time. I know in order to break even, I need to sell these cases at $42.73. In order to make a profit, all right, the third thing I want to do is make a $250 profit. Well, instead of my difference between revenue and expense being equal to 0, I want my revenue and expense difference to be equal to $250. So maybe to make this a little bit easier, I need my revenue to be $250 more than my expense. Well, since I have my revenue here, my expense here, I know that's going to be $250 greater. So revenue, price times quantity, is going to be $21,615. I'm just going to move over here so I have room. Again, I know I'm trying to do this off of 500 cases. So I'm going to divide, and I get a price of 43.33.